Hi everyone, my name is Chi and welcome to my channel. So today in this video I want to talk about the three main pillars of photography is aperture, shutter speed and ISO. The reason why I've decided to make this video because quite often I got asked about my settings, what settings I had to take this shot or for the other shot, and the thing is, unless there was like specific in-camera effect that has been achieved with the settings, then it makes sense. And I will go into kind of touch on it later on in this video. But overall, if it's just a shot, it's really makes no sense because unless you here with me taking the shot exactly in the same condition and light intensity and everything, it really makes no point. So I think that it's more important to really just talk about those three settings again and maybe clarify something. So I think this video will be more useful for beginner photographers and intermediate. Pro photographers probably all know all of these things that I'll be mentioning today in this video, but again, if you decide to stick around and still listen to that, you're very, very welcome. Okay, so let's start. First, I want to talk about aperture. What aperture is? Aperture is a setting that shows how much light goes onto the sensor of your camera. What does it mean? It controls the depth of field on your shot. What does it mean? Basically, it means what area or how much, it will be more accurate, how much will be sharp and how much will be blurred out. Now, it's not really about sharpness of the image, how to get your images sharp. It can contribute, but it's not really that. It's about that effect. Sometimes if you would see like a bokeh effect, and bokeh means it's like a blur background. That's all achieved by manipulating the aperture setting. Basically, how much of your subject or the object will be in focus and how much will be blurred out. That is aperture. The wider aperture is, the wider your setting of aperture is, the more light is coming in, the more blur will be into your picture and small portion of your image will be in the focus. What does it mean? Depending on type of photography that you do, again, I'll be making an example of what I do, and I do portraits, beauty and fashion mostly, so I rarely go wider than 3.2. Even 3.2 to me is a bit too wide. Sometimes 2.8, but it's usually only in a low light. So why I go wider in low light? It's just because what I said at the beginning. Aperture controls how much light goes onto the sensor. So aperture, the wider, it means it's open up lens within the lens more. So obviously more light's coming. So when you shoot in low light and you don't want to crank up your ISO too high, that's where you open up the aperture. But remember that open up aperture also creates shallower depth of field, meaning more things, more of the whatever you photograph and more of your object will going to be blurred out. Now in my studio I have a beautiful light. In this studio I have a beautiful light, but sometimes depending on the weather, and I never get the direct sunlight in my window, so again this is very nice. I always kind of get nice and diffused. But sometimes when it's very cloudy or it's darker, the light is getting very, the lightning sometimes is not enough. So I really feel instead of making ISO higher, I just make the aperture wider. When I shoot object, let's say mid-hip, right, like a full length or mid-hip, and my aperture is, let's say 3.2, is fine, just because most of my subject will be in focus. But what happens is whenever you're photographing and you're in the process and you come in closer maybe to take close-up, often you forget that your aperture opens so wide. So what happens is, if you photograph your subject really close and you're making a close-up, sometimes if your aperture will be too wide, what happens is, and you focus on your eyes will be, the eyes of the subject will be in focus, but the nose already can be blurred out, and it's not something that you want. Also, the other thing would happen, even if you, let's say, shoot even, I'd say 2.8, and you shoot very close, and you ask your subject, they just turn their head a little bit to the right or to the or to the left, what happens is only one eye will be in focus and the other one already will be blurred out. And in viewfinder you cannot really notice that. You will see it already after when you will import all your pictures on their computer. And I guess for portrait photo shoot, it's not a deal breaker, kinda. You can sell it as a creative effect, but in the end, if you photograph a portrait, you do want the whole face be in focus. So currently, whenever I shoot portraits, I go aperture not as wide than 4 and maybe even less than that. If you shoot portraiture of multiple subjects, I would suggest you to go not wider than 5.6 and maybe even 8. Just because, again, what will happen, multiple subjects might not be at exactly same level. So what happens if one subject is closer to the camera and the other further away, one of them will be blurred out, and that's, you don't want it either. And I remember when I was just starting out, that would happen once in the photo shoot, and that was a very good lesson for me. I was shooting multiple people, and I forgot to change aperture, and my aperture was wide, I think maybe 2.8 or 3.2. And what happened is, thankfully, I got multiple shots with different focus for the different subject, each of subject's eyes. I took multiple shots. So then, what happened when I was reviewing the picture, either one subject was in focus and the other one out of focus. And that was a big no-no. You cannot present picture when half of people out of focus. So I had to spend some time in Photoshop and compose from different pictures from everyone who was in focus at the time. You don't want to do that. You don't want to spend 30 minutes just, yeah. So that was a very good lesson for me. And I think that's why I'm saying always shoot more. Experience photography is all about practice. This type of lessons teach you really good. Once you're there cropping person by person, there wasn't that many of them, a few people. When you're cropping them and composing all together, you really learn that lesson very well. So remember, aperture is really important. Unless you want that beautiful bokeh effect, which you may be shooting outside and you have something further away behind your subject, let's say you shoot portraiture outside and you want it nicely blurred out, then the aperture makes sense, the wider aperture makes sense. But in portraiture, I wouldn't suggest you, and again, if you shoot in a very low light, then you probably have to open it, but then remember that it is very shallow depth of field, which means there is very little field will be on your image, but will be sharp. So consider it when you taking a picture. So yes, unless you want the bokeh, then I would suggest you for portraiture. I personally go 4, aperture 4, higher than that, so maybe 5.6. For the beauty shoot, I need everything sharp. So if you photograph beauty, and if you don't know what beauty is those close-ups that photographs hair or makeup or maybe jewelry or maybe nails. That is a beauty, editorial beauty shots. For those shots, you want everything sharp, because what your master, makeup artist or hair master, they did a lot of work, so they want all those details sharp. They don't want them nice, artistically blurred out. That's not a portrait. So for beauty shoot, I never go as wide as 8, and rarely 8. I would go maybe 9 or 11, 16 maybe, that's fine. Usually I shoot about 11. So remember about that very, very well. The more detail you want in your picture, the more detail you want in the background, the higher aperture you will do. By higher, I mean more narrow one. The more blur out you want, the more wider aperture you want. So for portraiture, I would suggest you start with 4 for one subject, and usually when you do close-up with 4 and they will turn around their head a little bit, usually it's still in focus. Unless you go very, very tight, then I would go again 5.6 or even 6 or even 8 for portrait. Okay, so I guess I've done with aperture. Let's go to the shutter speed. Okay, so I had to take some break just because neighbors has some front yard working and there's just some construction and it's just so loud noise, and I think they calm down a little bit now, so I'm continuing this video. But again, if there will be any noise in this video, some outside background noise, I do apologize for that. Let's continue. Shutter speed. Shutter speed is the setting that manages for how long your sensor will be exposed to the light. So the main concern for shutter speed is when you photograph in motion. What does it mean? Let's say you want to photograph bird in the air flying. So you need something, so you need the shutter be very, very fast. And if you want it very crisp and clean, right? You don't want wings in the motion blur. You don't want them blurry. You want them super crisp. So it means that you need your shutter very, very fast. And that probably will be like 1/500th of the second. I'm making an educated guess. I don't really know. I never shot birds in the sky, but probably. Or let's say in portrait, you want to photograph a flowy dress in the wind, or somebody will going to throw dress and you want to photograph that motion of the dress, let's say of the hair. So really depend on the effect that you want to achieve. Let's say you want that crisp shape of the dress just in that moment, in that very precise moment, then I would suggest you again to go at least 1/300th of the second or even 1/500th of the second, because you need it very, very fast to really make sure there is no motion blur introduced into the onto your image. But let's say the opposite. You would like to have an let's say model stand with and there is like a motion blurry dress, like that soft, like a bokeh effect type of fabric going around. That way you need to slow down your shutter, but make sure that when you slow down your shutter, your model will have to stand very, very still. Then I would suggest maybe 1/60th of the second, or even for that creamy effect, maybe 1/30th of the second, so half a second. Just remember, your model will have to be very, very still, but that's something that you can try. That's the effect that shutter speed can give you. You probably see the pictures when they would photograph a car and there is like a trail of light behind it. So that's how it's shot. It's shot with the slow shutter speed because the light was onto the sensor exposed for quite a long time to capture that continuous movement of the light. So that is slow shutter. Again, I guess maybe half a second, 1/30th of a second at least. Make sure that in that case, put your camera on the tripod, because motion is not just in front of the camera, but it's also if you hold it in your hands. Even micro movement in your hand can affect and create that motion blur in the picture, so a picture will be blurry and you don't want that. Shutter speed is not priority for me. For me, aperture is priority. That's what I usually go first. First, I think what aperture I want, how many details I want. Then I go for the shutter speed. Usually for portraiture, I should hand hold. Then I go maybe 1/25th to 1/60th of the second, depend on the light that I have inside my studio. Now these settings, all settings that I tell you, they all within my studio, so indoor. Outdoor it will be probably different, but that's what I usually go 1/25th of the second. I never go slower than that, just to be safe when it comes to motion blur, because I should hand hold. And I never had any motion blur problem if I shoot 1/25 and faster than that. If you have particularly shaky hand, then you might want to faster that shutter, maybe even 1/60th or even 200th of the second. Also, I would suggest you to get lenses with the image stabilization. That might be very good option for you. Some of my lenses does not have image stabilization. I shoot in 1/25 and that's fine. Never had any motion blur problem. So again, shutter speed is important when you shoot movement, when you want to capture motion. Now, this comes to natural light. Now, what comes to artificial light, if you shoot with the flash or strobe, I cannot put my shutter speed faster than, I believe, 250 of the 50th of the second. What does it mean? Why? Because your shutter will be too fast for your flash. And let's say that you would photograph something and you would crank up your shutter to 300 of the second, your picture will be completely black. Also, you can try to photograph with flash, maybe at setting or 250th of the second, and you would already start to see that border coming of your shutter you will see on your image. So never go higher than faster, let's say. Never go faster than 250, I believe, on shutter when you photograph with speedlight or strobe. Now, why is it not concern of mine, but why is it can be concern of yours? In my type of photography, I do not need that, I do not photograph that much motion because I shoot portrait and beauty and fashion, so I don't really photograph that motion. But let's say you photograph dancers or athletes and you photograph in studio with artificial light, with strobe or speed light, and you want to capture that movement, that moment of the movement, and you need it super crisp and super sharp. You will need your shutter to be much higher. You will need your shutter at least maybe 1/300 or 500 of the second to get that crisp, sharp move. For me, in my type of photography, usually shutter 1/25th or 1/60th of the second works for me. Okay, so I think that's it about shutter speed, and let's go for ISO. Now, ISO is abbreviation for something that I do not remember, but basically it's how sensitive your sensor will be to the light. And this is a very important setting, as three of them. That's what they always picture as a triangle because they all depend on one another. So ISO give you a possibility to make sensor more or less sensitive to the amount of light in the particular duration of time that will going to come onto your sensor. Let me give you an example. Let's say we shoot inside indoor the studio and it's a low light, but you don't want to open up your aperture too wide in order to let more light in. Let's say you still want those details, or you just have lens it does not allow you to open too wide. And also you don't want to introduce any motion blur into your shot, so you still want to keep your shutter speed at the appropriate setting. Then whereas ISO will be very helpful for you because you can increase the sensitivity of your camera, the sensor of your camera. So I would set my aperture, then I would set my shutter, and then in the end I would just look in my viewfinder and just increase my ISO to make a right exposure. So to me, ISO is the last setting that I adjust. Let me give you another example. Let's say you shoot in a broad daylight outside and it's very bright sun, and you still want that beautiful blurred bokeh background. And we talked before, for that you will need to open up your aperture, which means it will allow more sun, more light onto your sensor. So because you have so much light onto your sensor, you don't need it sensitive at all. So you could just put it on the least amount is 100 is the minimal setting for your ISO. What if it's still overexposed, when there is still too light? Then I would just crank up my shutter speed to whatever it is I need to set the correct exposure. So usually ISO is a great helper what comes to low light. I play with it most when I shoot with natural light in shadows somewhere. When I shoot with artificial light, it usually stands at 100 just because I can adjust my light. But let's say you don't have light strong enough, maybe you use continuous light or not strobe or speed light, then you can just crank up ISO to get the ideal aperture and shutter speed that you have. So this how these three connected. Again, you need to understand what type of photography you use, what effect you want to achieve. So remember, if you looking for the bokeh first, for example, or you want details in your picture, then aperture is what most important for you. Then you would set shutter and then you would set ISO. If you want some motion capture, some motion effect, then obviously you would emphasize for the shutter, and then you would set appropriate aperture, and then you would set ISO. Yeah, so I guess this is how these three connected, and that's about it for the video. I know it's been too long, but hopefully it's been useful and it cleared up something for some of you. Please let me know in the comments down below. Thumbs up if you did like the video, and subscribe to this channel to see more of that. Please share the videos with the friends and colleagues if you find them helpful. And if you want to see more of my work, please follow me on Instagram. It's @urinachi_photo. And I hope to see you next time. Bye!